We've all been judged by what we don't have, rather than who we are. Sometimes those who mock us most need us when their world falls apart. In a dusty frontier town, folks mocked a poor cowboy who rode a battered old donkey instead of a horse. But when a flash flood tore through the valley, sweeping away wagons and families, it was that stubborn donkey that carried souls to safety across raging waters. The townsfolk who once laughed found themselves bowing their heads in shame and gratitude, realizing that true worth was never measured in wealth or appearances, but in courage and heart. But what made this humble cowboy risk everything to save? The very people who had humiliated him. Before we jump in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows. Across the main street of Cedar Bend, a frontier town that sat nestled in the valley like a handful of weathered dice thrown by some gambling god. Dust motes danced in the golden light that filtered through the wooden awnings, and the air carried the familiar scents of horse leather, wood smoke, and the promise of another scorching day. Samuel Pike adjusted his worn hat and gave Jasper's neck a gentle pat. The old donkey's ears twitched forward, alert but patient, as they made their way down the rutted street toward Miller's general store. Samuel's boots, cracked but well-maintained, hung loosely in the stirrups that had seen better decades. His clothes told the story of a man who mended what tore and made do with what remained. Patched denim, a faded blue shirt, soft with age, and a leather vest that had belonged to his father. In his saddlebags, wrapped carefully in oiled cloth, lay his most precious possession, a leather-bound Bible worn smooth by countless readings. The pages held his father's penciled notes in the margins, observations about faith and life that Samuel had memorized over the years. That book had guided 3 generations of pikemen through trials, and Samuel often found himself touching the bag where it rested, drawing comfort from its presence. "Morning, Samuel," called out Mrs. Henderson from her boarding-house porch. She was one of the few who spoke to him with genuine warmth, her grey hair pinned back in a practical bun, and her weathered hands busy with morning chores. "How's Jasper? Treating you today?" "Like a gentleman as always, Mrs. Henderson," Samuel replied, tipping his hat. "Hope your garden's faring well with this heat. Better than most, thanks to your advice about the irrigation. That ditch you helped me dig has been a godsend." She smiled and waved as they passed. Such exchanges were rare treasures in Samuel's daily routine. More often, his appearances on the street drew snickers and pointed comments that he pretended not to hear. As if summoned by that very thought, the laughter began before he'd even reached the general store. "Look here, boys," came the voice of Jake Morrison, the banker's son. "The donkey rider graces us with his presence again." Jake stood with his usual crowd of young men outside the saloon, their horses tied to the hitching post like expensive ornaments. These were the sons of Cedar Bend's prominent families, well-dressed, well-fed, and well-convinced of their own importance. "Reckon he's heading to market to sell that fine steed of his?" chimed in Tom Bradley, whose father owned the largest ranch in 3 counties. The group erupted in laughter, slapping their knees and elbowing each other. Samuel kept his eyes forward, but Jasper's ears flicked back at the mockery. The donkey had endured this routine as long as his rider had, developing his own dignified patience with human foolishness. "Maybe we should take up a collection," suggested Charlie Whitman, the mayor's nephew. "Get the poor fellow a proper mount, so he doesn't embarrass our town when travelers pass through." The barbs continued, but Samuel had learned long ago that responding only encouraged them. He guided Jasper to the general store and dismounted. With the easy grace of a man who'd spent his life in the saddle, his movements were unhurried, purposeful, never giving his tormentors the satisfaction of seeing him flustered. Inside Miller's store, the atmosphere shifted. Old Pete Miller looked up from his ledger with a genuine smile. "Samuel, good to see you. Got that order of grain in yesterday, finest quality just like you requested." "Much obliged, Mr. Miller," Samuel counted out coins from a small leather pouch, each one carefully considered. "And I've got those fence posts cut and ready for delivery to the Henderson place if you're still willing to help with transport." "Course I am. Your work's the best in the valley, straight as arrows and strong as iron." Pete loaded the grain sacks while Samuel inspected some tools. "Don't mind those young fools out there. They've got more money than sense and more pride." "And than either," Samuel nodded thoughtfully. "Every man's got his own path to walk. Mine just happens to include Jasper there, and I couldn't ask for better company." Through the store window, they could see the group of young men still lounging outside the saloon. Their horses were indeed magnificent animals, spirited thoroughbreds. With gleaming coats and silver-adorned tack, the contrast between their mounts and Samuel's humble donkey was stark, and the young men never tired of pointing it out. "You know," Pete said, lowering his voice, "my grandfather used to tell stories about your father. Said he was one of the finest guides this territory ever saw, knew every trail, every water source, every shortcut through the mountains. Pa had his gifts," Samuel replied simply. "Taught me what he could before the fever took him. Shame how. Folks forget. Your pa guided the first settlers into this valley, helped them find the best spots for their claims. Half the prosperity in Cedar Bend can be traced back to his knowledge." Pete shook his head. "But memories are short when it comes to acknowledging debts." As Samuel prepared to leave, Mayor Whitman himself appeared in the doorway. Theodore Whitman was a large man who filled spaces not just with his considerable bulk, but with an air of self-importance that preceded him like cologne. His vest strained against his belly, and his watch chain caught the morning light with each breath. "Pike," he said with a curt nod, "I trust you're keeping that animal of yours out of trouble. Had complaints about it blocking traffic on Main Street." Samuel's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained level. "Jasper and I keep to our business, Mr. Mayor. Haven't blocked any traffic that wasn't already moving slower than Sunday service. See that it stays that way. This town's got a reputation to maintain, and we can't have visitors getting the wrong impression." Whitman's eyes swept over Samuel's patched clothes and Jasper's humble appearance. "Perhaps it's time you considered a more conventional mode of transportation. Perhaps it's time folks considered judging a man by his character instead of his circumstances," Samuel replied quietly. "But I reckon that's between each person and their conscience." The mayor's face reddened, but before he could respond, Samuel had touched his hat brim and walked past him to where Jasper waited. The donkey greeted him with a soft, nickering sound and nuzzled his shoulder, a gesture of affection that spoke volumes about the bond between them. As they rode out of town, Samuel reflected on the morning's encounters. The mockery didn't sting as much as it once had. He'd developed thick skin over the years. What troubled him more was the waste of it all. The energy spent on petty cruelties when there was so much work to be done, so much good that needed doing. In the world, Jasper seemed to sense his mood and picked up his pace slightly. They headed toward the Peterson farm, where Samuel had promised to help repair a barn roof damaged in the previous week's storm. It was honest work that paid modestly, but it allowed him to contribute something meaningful to the community, even if most folks didn't appreciate it. The Peterson place sat on higher ground, offering a view of the entire valley. As they climbed the winding trail, Samuel noticed how green everything looked despite the recent heat. The creek that ran through the center of town sparkled in the distance, and the cottonwood trees along its banks swayed in a gentle breeze. It was beautiful. Country, the kind of place a man could build a life if he was willing to work for it. But Samuel also noticed other things. The way the creek ran higher than usual for this time of year, the dark clouds that had been building over the mountains each afternoon, the restless behavior of wildlife he'd observed on his rounds. His father had taught him to read the signs that nature provided, lessons learned from years of guiding travelers through unpredictable terrain. The thought of his father brought a familiar ache to his chest. Jacob Pike had been everything Samuel aspired to be, strong, wise, compassionate, and respected by all who knew him. He'd possessed an almost supernatural ability to navigate the wilderness and had saved countless lives through his skill and courage. Samuel had inherited his knowledge but not his reputation, and he sometimes wondered if he was truly worthy of carrying on the family tradition. At the Peterson farm, he was greeted warmly by Sarah Peterson and her 3 children. Her husband had died 2 winters past, leaving her to manage the property alone. Samuel had been helping with repairs and heavy work ever since, never accepting more payment than she could afford. "Samuel!" called young Billy Peterson, running toward them. "Is Jasper going to help with the roof today?" "He might supervise," Samuel replied with a smile. "Jasper's got strong opinions about proper construction techniques." As if understanding the conversation, Jasper brayed softly and shook his head, causing the children to giggle. Sarah Peterson watched the interaction with gentle eyes, seeing something that the townspeople missed: the quiet strength, the natural kindness, the unshakable integrity that defined Samuel Pike. The work went well, with Samuel's steady hands and careful attention to detail, ensuring that the repairs would last through many seasons. As the day progressed, those ominous clouds continued building over the mountains, and the wind began to pick up in a way that made the experienced frontiersman uneasy. By evening, as Samuel and Jasper made their way back toward his small cabin outside of town, the first fat raindrops began to fall. The air had that electric feeling that preceded serious weather, and Jasper's ears were constantly moving, alert to sounds and scents that his human companion couldn't perceive. Samuel's cabin sat on a rise overlooking the valley, strategically positioned where his father had taught him to build, high enough to stay dry, close enough to town to help when needed, and always with multiple escape routes into the mountains if circumstances demanded it. As he settled Jasper in the small stable and prepared for the night, Samuel found himself studying the weather patterns with growing concern. The rain intensified as darkness fell, drumming against the cabin roof with increasing urgency. Samuel lit his oil lamp and opened his father's Bible, seeking comfort in familiar passages. But even as he read, his attention kept drifting to the sounds outside. The growing roar of water, the creaking of trees in the wind, and underneath it all, the whispered warnings of a storm that might prove to be more than just another passing shower. 3 days of steady rain had transformed Cedar Bend from a dusty frontier town into something resembling a soggy biscuit left too long in gravy. The unpaved streets had become rivers of mud that sucked at boots and wagon wheels with equal enthusiasm. Water dripped from every eave and awning, creating a constant percussion that echoed off the wooden buildings. Samuel stood at his cabin window, watching the storm clouds mass over the mountains like gathering armies. The rain wasn't the gentle spring shower the townspeople seemed to think it was. This had the feel of something more serious, more dangerous. His father's lessons echoed in his memory. When the clouds build like castle walls, and the wind changes direction 3 times. In an hour, smart folks start thinking about higher ground. Jasper stood in the stable doorway, his usually calm demeanor replaced by an alertness that made Samuel's own nerves prickle. The donkey's ears pivoted constantly, tracking sounds that human ears couldn't catch. Animals knew things his father had taught him. They felt the earth's moods in ways that civilized men had forgotten. By noon, Samuel made his decision. He saddled Jasper and rode into town, his oilcloth coat doing little to keep the driving rain from finding every gap and seam. The creek that normally bubbled pleasantly through the center of Cedar Bend now rushed with muddy urgency, carrying debris from upstream, broken branches, fence posts, and stranger things that spoke of serious flooding in the higher elevations. The town's main street looked like a battlefield where mud had claimed victory. The few people brave enough to venture outside hugged the buildings, darting between covered porches like soldiers avoiding sniper fire. Samuel guided Jasper carefully through the mire, both of them accustomed to difficult terrain but respectful of the dangerous footing. He found Mayor Whitman holding court in the saloon, surrounded by the usual circle of prominent citizens who nodded sagely at his every pronouncement. The mayor's voice boomed over the rain, drumming on the roof, full of confidence and authority. "Nothing more than a summer storm," Whitman was saying as Samuel pushed through the doors. "We've seen worse weather than this, and Cedar Bend has weathered every challenge thrown at it." "Begging your pardon, Mr. Mayor," Samuel interrupted, water dripping from his hat brim onto the sawdust floor. "But this isn't just a summer storm. The creek's running higher than I've seen in years, and there's debris coming down from the mountains that suggests serious flooding upstream." The conversation stopped. Every eye in the room turned to Samuel, with expressions ranging from annoyance to outright hostility. Jake Morrison laughed first, a sound like breaking glass. Well, the donkey whisperer thinks he can predict the weather now." More laughter rippled through the group. "What's next, Pike? Going to read our palms and tell our fortunes?" "I'm telling you what I've observed," Samuel said steadily. "The signs point to flooding, serious flooding. The town sits in a natural bowl, and if that creek keeps rising, the town sits exactly where my grandfather built it 30 years ago. Mayor Whitman interrupted, his face flushing red above his collar. "And it's survived every storm since." "Then I think we can trust in something more reliable than the weather predictions of a man who can't even afford a proper horse." Sheriff Garrett, a weathered man with more sense than most, leaned forward in his chair. "What exactly are you seeing out there, Samuel?" "The creek's carrying timber that's been stripped clean. Bark gone, branches torn off. That doesn't happen from regular rain. It happens when water moves fast and hard, like it does in a flash flood. And the wildlife's acting strange, birds flying in circles, rabbits running toward town instead of away from it." "Fascinating folklore," said Dr. Henley, the town's physician, "and self-appointed authority on all matters scientific. But I prefer to rely on meteorological instruments rather than animal behavior. My barometer indicates typical storm pressure, nothing more." Samuel pulled off his hat and ran fingers through his damp hair. "My father guided settlers through this valley for 20 years. He taught me to read the signs that instruments can't measure. The mountains are shedding water like a broken dam, and it's all flowing this way." "Your father," said Banker Morrison with barely concealed disdain, "also died alone in a shack, broke as a church mouse. Perhaps his weather wisdom wasn't as valuable as you'd like us to believe." The words hit Samuel like physical blows, but he kept his voice level. "My father saved lives, more lives than anyone in this room will ever know about, and right now his knowledge is telling me that this town is in danger." "Danger from what?" Whitman demanded. "A little mud? Some inconvenient puddles? Pike, you're letting your imagination run away with you. This is what happens when a man spends too much time alone with livestock for company." The laughter that followed was cruel and dismissive. Samuel felt heat rise in his cheeks, but he pressed on. "I'm offering to help. I know the high trails, the safe routes out of the valley. If the water keeps rising, if, Jake Morrison interrupted, "here's what we know for certain. You ride a donkey because you're too poor for a real horse. You live in a shack because you're too lazy for real work. And now you're trying to scare us into running away from our homes based on nothing but your wild theories and animal superstitions." "The boy has a point," added Charlie Whitman. "Panic-mongering is a serious accusation. Perhaps Pike here is hoping we'll all flee so he can loot our abandoned properties." Samuel's hand tightened on his hat, but his voice remained steady. "I'm not asking you to flee. I'm asking you to prepare. Make sure your families know where the high ground is. Keep some supplies ready. Have plans for—" "Enough!" Mayor Whitman slammed his glass down on the bar. "I won't have this community terrorized by doomsday predictions from a man whose judgment is clearly compromised by his circumstances. Samuel Pike, you are no longer welcome in this establishment. Take your donkey and your delusions somewhere, else The silence that followed was broken only by the rain, hammering the roof and the distant rumble of water rushing past the town's foundations. Samuel looked around the room, meeting the eyes of men he'd known his entire life. Some looked away in embarrassment, but none spoke in his defense. "I hope I'm wrong," he said finally, settling his hat back on his head. "For all our sakes, I truly hope I'm wrong." He walked back into the storm, leaving behind the warmth and dry certainty of the saloon. Jasper waited patiently, rain streaming off his sturdy frame. The donkey looked at Samuel with dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to understand everything that had transpired inside. "Well, old friend," Samuel murmured, checking the cinch on his saddle. "Looks like it's just you and me again." As they rode back through the muddy streets, Samuel noticed things that confirmed his growing alarm. Water stood in places that had been dry that morning. The creek's roar had grown louder, more aggressive. And somewhere in the distance, barely audible over the storm, came a sound that made his blood run cold. The deep, continuous rumble of massive amounts of water moving through confined spaces. Back at his cabin, Samuel began preparations that his father had drilled into him since childhood. Emergency supplies went into waterproof bundles. Essential tools were packed and secured. Most importantly, he opened his father's old survey maps and studied the terrain with new urgency. The valley that cradled Cedar Bend was shaped like a funnel, with narrow canyons feeding into the wider basin where the town sat. In normal conditions, this geography provided excellent drainage, but in extreme conditions, the kind his father had witnessed once in his lifetime, it could turn the entire area into a death trap. Samuel traced the various routes out of the valley, calculating travel times and identifying potential obstacles. There were 3 main trails: the wagon road that wound gradually upward to the east, the steep mining trail to the north, and the treacherous but direct path over the southern ridge that only experienced mountain men attempted. If his fears proved correct, if the floods came with the fury he suspected, only one of those routes would remain passable. And the only mount in the entire valley, sure-footed enough to navigate it safely, stood in his stable, methodically chewing hay while rain drummed overhead. As night fell and the storm showed no signs of weakening, Samuel found himself standing at his window again, watching the town's lights flicker through the rain. Part of him hoped the men in the saloon were right, that this was just another storm, that his father's lessons had made him overly cautious, that tomorrow would dawn clear and peaceful. But deep in his bones, in the place where intuition lived, he knew better. The real test was coming, and Cedar Bend was about to learn the difference between preparation and regret. Dawn brought no relief. The rain continued with relentless determination, and Samuel woke to find water where water had never been before. The small stream that ran behind his cabin, usually no more than a trickle even in wet seasons, now rushed with alarming volume, carrying mud and debris from somewhere higher up the mountain. He pulled on his boots and stepped outside to check on Jasper. The donkey stood alert in his stall, ears pricked forward as if listening to conversations in languages only animals understood. When Samuel approached, Jasper nuzzled his shoulder with unusual insistence, a gesture that spoke of shared concern. "I know, boy," Samuel murmured, running his hand along the donkey's sturdy neck. "You feel it too, don't you? The mountain's getting ready to shed more water than it can hold." From his cabin's elevated position, Samuel could see the town below, shrouded in mist and rain. Even at this distance, the creek running through Cedar Bend appeared wider, angrier than it had been the previous day. What worried him most was the debris field visible along its banks, chunks of timber, pieces of buildings, and what looked like sections of bridge planking from somewhere upstream. He saddled Jasper and rode down toward town, not because he expected a warmer reception than the day before, but because someone needed to witness what was happening. Someone needed to document the signs for whatever came after. The main street had transformed overnight. What had been mud yesterday now resembled a shallow river, with water flowing steadily between the buildings. The wooden sidewalks creaked ominously under the weight of standing water, and several shop owners were using buckets to bail out their establishments. At Miller's General Store, old Pete stood on his porch looking out at the flooded street with troubled eyes. He raised his hand in greeting when he spotted Samuel. "Morning, Pete," Samuel called out, guiding Jasper as close to the porch as the water would allow. "How are your supplies holding up?" "Dry goods are fine, stored up high like my daddy taught me, but I'm starting to worry about some of the newer folks who didn't listen to the old-timers about where to build." Pete shook his head. "The Morrison place down by the creek is taking on water fast. Banker's son's been running around all morning trying to sandbag his front door." Samuel felt no satisfaction in being proved right. "What about the bridge?" "Still standing, but she's groaning something fierce. Current's gotten underneath the supports and started undermining the foundation stones." Pete squinted through the rain. "You still think we're in for worse?" "I'm afraid so. The debris coming down suggests there's been serious flooding upstream. Could be a dam break, could be a landslide blocking and releasing water. Hard to tell without riding up to investigate. And I suppose our esteemed mayor is still calling this just a summer shower." Samuel's expression darkened slightly. "Mayor, Whitman made his position clear yesterday. Don't reckon it's changed much overnight." As if summoned by their conversation, a small crowd emerged from the saloon across the street. Mayor Whitman led the group, his bulk wrapped in an expensive rain slicker that made him look like a well-fed bear. Behind him came the usual collection of prominent citizens, all talking loudly over the sound of the rain. "Just a matter of waiting it out," Whitman was saying as they splashed through the flooded street. "Weather like this never lasts more than a few days. We'll have sunshine by the weekend." Jake Morrison looked considerably less confident than his father had the night before. The young man's boots were soaked through, and his usually immaculate appearance showed signs of a sleepless night spent fighting rising water. "Maybe we should consider some precautions," Jake suggested. "I mean, just basic preparations in case—" "In a case of what?" his father interrupted. "In case we let Pike's hysteria infect our judgment? Son, this town has weathered storms before. A little mud and inconvenience never killed anyone." Samuel guided Jasper closer to the group, close enough to be heard, but not close enough to be accused of eavesdropping. "Morning, gentlemen. How's everyone faring with the water?" The response was a mixture of glares and uncomfortable shuffling. Dr. Henley stepped forward, apparently designated as spokesman. "We're managing quite well, Pike. A little moisture never hurt anyone. Certainly nothing that requires your particular brand of apocalyptic warnings." "Glad to hear it," Samuel replied evenly. "Though if anyone needs help moving belongings to higher ground, I'm available. No charge, of course." Charlie Whitman snorted. "Still trying to play the hero, I see. What's the real game here, Pike? You hoping we'll panic and pay you to guide us out of our own town?" "I'm hoping," Samuel said carefully, "that I'm wrong about how bad this could get. But if I'm right, it won't matter who pays who for anything. We'll all be too busy trying to stay alive." Mayor Whitman's face flushed despite the cool, wet air. "That's quite enough doom and gloom for one morning. Pike, I'm warning you. If you continue spreading panic in this community, there will be consequences. We have laws about disturbing the peace." Samuel touched his hat brim in a gesture that managed to be both respectful and subtly defiant. "I understand your position, Mr. Mayor. I'll be at my cabin if anyone needs assistance." As he turned Jasper away from the group, Samuel caught sight of Mrs. Henderson watching from her boarding house window. Unlike the men's hostility, her expression showed genuine concern, not for the weather, but for him. She raised her hand in a small wave, and he nodded back before continuing down the street. The water level had risen another 2 inches since dawn. Samuel could see it in the way the creek now lapped at the foundations of buildings that had stood dry for decades. The bridge groaned audibly with each surge of current, its support timbers flexing in ways that made experienced engineers nervous. At the Peterson farm on higher ground, Samuel found Sarah and her children preparing for the worst, despite their elevated position. She greeted him with relief visible in her eyes. "Samuel, thank goodness. I was hoping you'd come by. The children are scared, and honestly, so am I. Is it as bad as it looks?" "It could get worse," he admitted, dismounting near her porch. "But you're smart to prepare. Your elevation here should keep you safe from all but the most extreme flooding." Young Billy Peterson emerged from the house carrying an armload of quilts. "Ma says we might need to go to the attic if the water gets too high. Will Jasper be okay?" Samuel smiled at the boy's concern. "Jasper's been through worse weather than this. Donkeys are tough, smart animals. They know how to take care of themselves when trouble comes." "Smarter than some people, I reckon," Sarah said pointedly, glancing toward town. "I heard about yesterday at the saloon. Folks can be mighty foolish when their pride's at stake." "Pride's a luxury most can't afford when the water's rising," Samuel observed, checking the bundles he'd strapped to Jasper's saddle. "But I suppose everyone has to face their own storms in their own way." As the day wore on, the signs continued to multiply. More debris in the creek, higher water levels, and an ominous rumbling from the mountains that spoke of massive amounts of water seeking the path of least resistance. Samuel made mental notes of everything he observed, mapping out scenarios and contingencies with the methodical thoroughness his father had instilled in him. By evening, even the most optimistic residents were beginning to acknowledge that this storm was different. But acknowledgement was a far cry from action, and Cedar Bend's leadership remained stubbornly committed to their stance of confident dismissal. Samuel returned to his cabin as darkness fell, knowing that tomorrow would likely bring the test he'd been dreading. The mountain couldn't hold much more water, and when it finally let go, Cedar Bend would discover just how much their pride was worth. The fourth day dawned grey and ominous, with rain falling in sheets that seemed solid as curtains. Samuel woke to find Jasper standing at the stable door, already alert and ready, as if the donkey understood that today would test them both. The animal's usual patient demeanor had given way to something more urgent, ears constantly moving, nostrils flaring to catch scents that told stories human noses couldn't read. "What is it, old friend?" Samuel asked, approaching slowly. Jasper turned his large, intelligent eyes toward the mountains, then back to Samuel, then toward the mountains. Again, the message was clear. Something up there demanded attention. Samuel checked his emergency supplies one more time. Food for 3 days, medical kit, rope, tools for emergency repairs, and his father's compass wrapped in oiled leather. Everything fit into compact bundles that wouldn't unbalance Jasper during difficult travel. He'd learned efficiency from necessity. Every pound carried had to earn its place. The ride into town revealed a community beginning to fracture under the pressure of rising water. What had been merely inconvenient flooding the day before now threatened livelihoods and homes. The creek had swollen to nearly twice its normal width, and muddy water lapped at doorsteps that had never seen moisture before. Near the bridge, Samuel encountered a group of younger men attempting to reinforce the structure with whatever materials they could gather. Their fathers might dismiss the danger, but these men had eyes that could see water undermining stone foundations. "Morning, boys," Samuel called out, guiding Jasper to the bridge's edge. "How's she holding up?" Tom Bradley looked up from the timber he was wrestling into position. Despite their past antagonism, desperation had a way of erasing social boundaries. "Not good, Pike. Lost about 6 inches of foundation on the south side overnight. If this current keeps up, we might lose the whole span." "That would cut the town in half," Samuel observed, studying the bridge's construction with experienced eyes. "Folks on the south side would be trapped if the water keeps rising." "That's what we're trying to prevent," Jake Morrison said, though his tone lacked its usual mockery. Mud covered his expensive clothes, and exhaustion marked his young face. "Problem is, we don't know much about this kind of engineering." Samuel dismounted and walked to where they were working. The bridge's design was solid, but old, built when the creek was smaller and calmer. The current foundation couldn't handle the water's new volume and velocity. "You're fighting the symptom instead of the cause," he said after studying their efforts. "Water's going to go where it wants to go. Your best bet is to redirect some of the flow instead of trying to hold it all in one channel." "How do you mean?" Tom asked, leaning on his shovel. Samuel pointed upstream. "See how the creek makes that? Sharp bend about 200 yards up. Water hits that curve with full force and gets pushed straight at your bridge. But if you opened a spillway there, let some water flow into that natural depression to the east, you'd reduce the pressure, here by maybe 20%. The young men exchanged glances. Jake Morrison wiped mud from his forehead, leaving a streak of clean skin that made him look even younger than his years. Would that actually work? "Can't guarantee it, but it's better than what you're doing now." Samuel replied honestly. "Course it would mean digging in this rain, and your fathers might not appreciate the suggestion coming from me." Charlie Whitman arrived at that moment, leading a group of older men, including his uncle, the mayor. Their expressions ranged from annoyed to outright hostile as they took in the scene of Samuel offering advice to their sons. "What's going on here?" Mayor Whitman demanded. "I thought I made it clear that Pike's services weren't needed in this town." "Pa, he's trying to help," Charlie protested. "He knows about water management, about filling young men's heads." "With panic," Whitman interrupted. "Step away from that man, all of you. We don't need his kind of help." Samuel felt the familiar sting of rejection, but kept his voice level. "I was just explaining how water flow works, how redirecting some current might save your bridge." "Our bridge has stood for 30 years, Banker Morrison declared. "It'll stand for 30 more. We don't need advice from someone who can't even afford proper transportation." The insult hung in the air like the scent of rot. Samuel felt Jasper shift beside him, the donkey's ears pinning back at the hostility in Morrison's voice. Animals, Samuel had learned, were excellent judges of character. "That's enough," Sheriff Garrett said, stepping forward. Unlike the other prominent men, Garrett carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who'd seen real danger. "Pike's not causing trouble. He's offering knowledge that might be useful." "Useful?" Dr. Henley laughed bitterly. "What's useful is maintaining calm in a crisis, not listening to doomsday predictions from a man whose judgment is clearly compromised by his circumstances." Samuel's patience, worn thin by days of frustration and mounting concern, finally began to fray. "My circumstances, Doctor, have taught me to see things as they are, instead of as I'd like them to be. That creek is carrying timber from bridges that failed upstream. The debris field suggests multiple dam breaks in the high country, and unless this rain stops soon, you're going to find out exactly what compromised judgment looks like." "Is that a threat?" Whitman demanded. "It's an observation. Same kind of observation that might have saved lives if anyone had listened to my father 23 years ago when Willow Creek flooded." Samuel's voice carried a weight of old pain. 16 people died that spring because pride mattered more than preparation. The reference hit home. Several of the older men shifted uncomfortably. They remembered that flood, remembered Jacob Pike's warnings being dismissed, remembered the bodies pulled from the water days later. "That was different," Morrison said, but with less conviction than before. "Different how? Different water, different mountains, different laws of gravity." Samuel shook his head. "The only difference is that my father was trying to save strangers passing through. I'm trying to save neighbors who've made it clear they don't want saving." He remounted Jasper with the fluid motion of a man born to the saddle. The donkey responded immediately, turning toward the trail that led out of town. "Where are you going?" Jake Morrison called out, surprising everyone, including himself. Samuel paused. "To check the high trails while they're still passable. Someone should know which routes will be available if evacuation becomes necessary." "And if it does become necessary?" Tom Bradley asked. "Then I'll do what my father would have done. I'll guide anyone who wants to live through it to safety, regardless of how they've treated me." Samuel touched his hat brim. "That's what neighbors do for each other." As they rode away from the bridge, Jasper's steady gait carried them through water. that now reached the donkey's knees in some places. The animal navigated the treacherous footing with remarkable sure-footedness, never slipping or stumbling despite the slick mud and hidden obstacles. This was why Samuel had chosen to keep riding Jasper, even when townsfolk mocked him for it. Horses were faster, more glamorous, better suited to impressing onlookers, but donkeys were survivors. They were cautious where horses were reckless, steady where horses were nervous, and absolutely tireless when endurance mattered more than speed. In the mountains above Cedar Bend, where narrow trails wound through rockfalls and creek crossings, where one misstep meant a deadly fall, Jasper was worth more than all the fine thoroughbreds in the valley combined. As they climbed toward the high country, Samuel felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like his father's old coat. Soon, very soon, that responsibility would be tested in ways he could barely imagine. The sound came first, a deep, continuous rumble from the mountains that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Samuel was halfway up the northern trail when he heard it, a bass note that vibrated through rock and soil and into the bones of anyone wise enough to listen. Jasper stopped dead in his tracks, ears swiveling like compass needles seeking magnetic. "North, easy, boy," Samuel murmured, but his own voice betrayed his growing alarm. This was the sound his father had described, but Samuel had never heard. The sound of massive water moving through confined spaces, gathering speed and power as it sought lower ground. From his elevated position, Samuel could see the entire valley, spread below him like a map drawn in shades of grey and green. Cedar Bend sat in the bottom of the bowl, its buildings looking suddenly small and vulnerable against the vast landscape. But what captured his attention was the creek itself, now visibly swollen beyond anything the town had ever experienced. Then he saw it, a wall of muddy water surging around the bend upstream, carrying trees, boulders, and pieces of what had once been human construction. The flash flood had arrived with the unstoppable force that Samuel had been dreading. "Hold on, Jasper," he said, gripping the reins tighter. "We're about to see just how bad this gets." The wall of water hit Cedar Bend's bridge with the impact of a freight train. Even from a distance, Samuel could hear the grinding crash of stone and timber failing under impossible pressure. The structure that had stood for 3 decades disappeared in seconds, swallowed by the brown torrent that had once been a peaceful creek. Jasper brayed, a sound of alarm that carried clearly across the valley. The donkey had witnessed flash floods before during their travels in the high country, and he understood the danger better than most humans would. Samuel turned Jasper around and began the treacherous descent back toward town, his mind racing through calculations and contingencies. With the bridge gone, the community was effectively split in half. Anyone on the south side of the creek was trapped, cut off from the main town and any hope of conventional evacuation. The trip down took twice as long as usual, with Jasper picking his way carefully through terrain made treacherous by flowing water and loose mud. But the donkey's mountain-bred instincts served them well, finding secure footing where a horse would have slipped and fallen. They reached the outskirts of Cedar Bend to find chaos. People stood in the flooded streets, some crying, others shouting instructions that no one seemed to hear. The creek had spread far beyond its normal banks, turning entire blocks into shallow lakes, dotted with half-submerged buildings. Near where the bridge had stood, a crowd gathered on the north bank, staring across the rushing water at neighbors who might as well have been on another continent. The gap was perhaps 50 yards, but the current moved with such violence that swimming would be suicide. "My children are over there," Mrs. Patterson was sobbing, pointing toward the south side, where her house sat surrounded by rising water. "My babies are trapped." Sheriff Garrett stood with his hat in his hands, water dripping from his grey hair, as he studied the situation with the grim expression of a man running out of options. When he saw Samuel approaching, something like relief flickered in his weathered face. "Pike!" he called out. "Thank God you're here. We need every able man we can get." The crowd turned at Garrett's words, and Samuel found himself facing the same people who had mocked and dismissed him just hours before. Their expressions now ranged from desperate hope to embarrassed acknowledgement of their previous errors. Mayor Whitman pushed through the crowd, his expensive clothes soaked and muddy, his usual bluster replaced by barely controlled panic. "Pike, we need—" He struggled with words that didn't come easily to a man accustomed to command. "Can you help us?" Samuel dismounted and walked to the water's edge, studying the current and the debris it carried. Logs the size of telephone. Poles tumbled past like matchsticks. Pieces of houses, wagons, and livestock testified to the destruction upstream. "How many people are stranded on the south side?" he asked. 14 adults, 6 children, Garrett replied immediately. "The Patterson kids, old Mrs. Crawford, the Miller family, and several others. Water's rising fast over there. Some of those houses might not hold much longer." Samuel nodded, his experienced eye reading the flood patterns. Currents too strong for a rope bridge, and any boat would be smashed to pieces before it crossed halfway. But the water might be shallow enough upstream where the creek spreads out more. "How far upstream?" Dr. Henley asked, his earlier dismissiveness replaced by urgent concern. 2, maybe 3 miles. "There's a natural ford where the creek runs. Wider and slower. Might be passable for someone who knows the bottom and has the right mount." Samuel's eyes found Jasper, who stood calmly despite the chaos around them. "Question is whether there's time to make the trip before the water rises too high there as well." Jake Morrison stepped forward, his young face grave with newfound responsibility. "What do you need from us?" "Rope. All you can spare. Medical supplies. And someone who can organize the people on the south side, get them ready to move when we arrive." Samuel's mind was already working through the logistics. "Most important, I need everyone to understand that this isn't a discussion or a democracy. When I say move, you move. When I say stop, you stop. Hesitation kills people in situations like this." Mayor Whitman opened his mouth as if to assert his authority, then seemed to think better of it. The destroyed bridge and rising water had stripped away the luxury of political posturing. "You'll do it then?" Mrs. Patterson asked, hope and desperation warring in her voice. "You'll bring them back?" Samuel looked across the rushing water to where smoke rose from chimneys on the south side, where people waited for rescue that might never come. His father's voice echoed in his memory. "Sometimes a man has to do what's right, regardless of how he's been treated. I'll do what I can," he said simply. "But I need everyone to understand. This is going to be dangerous. For them, for me, for Jasper. Flash floods don't negotiate and they don't give second chances." "What can we do to help?" Sheriff Garrett asked. "Get that rope organized into manageable lengths. Send someone to gather blankets and hot food. People in shock from cold water. Need both. And pray," Samuel added, checking Jasper's girth strap. "Pray that the ford upstream is still passable and that we have enough daylight left to make multiple trips." As he prepared to mount up, Charlie Whitman approached, his face flushed with shame and something that might have been admiration. "Pike, Samuel, I owe you an apology." "We all do." Samuel paused, one foot in the stirrup. "Save the apologies for after we get everyone to safety. Right now, I need you to help organize the rescue effort from this end. Can you do that?" Charlie nodded eagerly, grateful for the chance to redeem himself through useful action. "Whatever you need." "Then let's get to work," Samuel said, swinging into the saddle. "Time's not on our side, and the water's still rising." As he and Jasper headed upstream along the flooded creek bank, Samuel could feel the weight of 14 adult lives and 6 children's futures resting on his shoulders, and on the sure feet of the donkey that had never let him down. The ride upstream revealed devastation that Samuel had only imagined in his worst fears. What had once been orderly farmland now resembled a battlefield where water had claimed victory over human ambition. Fences hung in tatters, crops lay flattened under inches of mud, and livestock huddled on whatever high ground they could find. Jasper navigated the treacherous terrain with the steady confidence that had earned Samuel's trust over the years. The donkey's hooves found purchase on slippery surfaces where a horse would have struggled, and his low center of gravity kept them both stable when the current tugged at their legs. They reached the ford to find it transformed, but still potentially passable. Where once a gentle creek had meandered through scattered stones, now an angry river rushed between banks it had carved wider in just hours. The water ran perhaps waist-deep at the center, manageable for Jasper, but dangerous for anyone. Less sure-footed, Samuel studied the crossing from every angle, reading the water like his father had taught him. The current was strong but not violent here, spreading its energy across a wider channel. More importantly, the bottom appeared stable, rocky rather than muddy, less likely to shift underfoot. "What do you think, boy?" he asked Jasper, who stood at the water's edge, with his ears forward, assessing the crossing with donkey wisdom. "Can we make it across and back with passengers?" Jasper's response was to step deliberately into the water, testing its depth and current. The first few steps confirmed Samuel's assessment, difficult but manageable. They waded carefully to the deepest point, where water swirled around Jasper's belly, but never threatened to sweep them downstream. The crossing took 10 tense minutes, but they emerged on the south bank to find desperate people waiting. Mrs. Crawford, the elderly widow, sat on her porch steps clutching a carpet bag that probably contained her life's most precious possessions. The Miller family had gathered with their 3 young children, while the Patterson boys pressed close too, their temporary guardians eyes wide with fear and excitement. "Thank God you made it across," called out Robert Miller, splashing toward them through ankle-deep water. "We saw the bridge go from here. Sounded like the end of the world." Samuel dismounted and waded toward the group, assessing their condition with experienced eyes. All were frightened but uninjured, though the children showed signs of shock from the cold and stress. Mrs. Crawford looked particularly frail, her weathered face pale beneath her grey hair. "How much time do we have?" asked Mrs. Patterson, who had arrived to care for her stranded neighbors when the flooding began. Samuel looked back across the rushing ford, calculating. "Water's still rising, but slowly now. I'd guess we have maybe 3 hours before this crossing becomes impossible. That means we need to move fast and light." "Light?" Robert Miller gestured toward the pile of belongings his family had assembled. "These are our possessions, everything we own. And they'll still be here when the water goes down, assuming the houses hold," Samuel replied firmly. "Right now we're moving people, not property. 1 small bag per adult, nothing for the children but warm clothes." The adults exchanged glances, the weight of abandoning their material accumulations heavy in the air. These were frontier folk who understood that possessions meant security, that losing tools or furniture could mean the difference between comfort and hardship through the coming winter. But the sound of the rushing water made the choice for them. Mrs. Crawford stood up slowly, leaving her carpet bag on the porch. "In 67 years on this earth," she said with quiet dignity, "I've learned that things can be replaced. People cannot." Her example shamed the others into similar decisions. One by one, they selected only essential items. Medicine for Mrs. Crawford's arthritis, a family Bible, a child's favorite toy to provide comfort during the frightening journey ahead. "Who goes first?" Samuel asked, though he'd already made that calculation. "Mrs. Crawford, you'll ride with me. You're the lightest passenger, and Jasper needs to test his footing with a rider before we risk the children." The elderly woman looked skeptical. "I've never ridden a donkey in my life." "Jasper's steadier than most rocking chairs," Samuel assured her, helping her approach the patient animal. "He's carried people through worse terrain than this." As if sensing the need to inspire confidence, Jasper stood perfectly still while Mrs. Crawford settled herself sideways across his back, her arms around Samuel's waist. The arrangement was awkward but secure. "Hold on tight and trust his judgment," Samuel instructed. "Donkeys are smarter about water than most people realize." The return crossing took longer with a passenger, but Jasper's sure-footedness proved equal to the challenge. The donkey paused at each uncertain step, testing the bottom before committing his weight. When they reached the north bank, a cheer went up from the waiting crowd. 1 down, 19 to go, Samuel muttered, helping Mrs. Crawford down from Jasper's back. She stood unsteadily for a moment, then straightened with the resilience that had carried her through 6 decades of frontier life. "Young man," she said, grasping Samuel's hands in both of hers, "I owe you my life. We all do." Mayor Whitman approached as Samuel prepared for the second crossing. The big man's face showed a mixture of gratitude and shame that he struggled to express. "Pike, he began, then stopped, searching for words that had never come easily to him. "I want you to know that the town will remember this. We'll remember what you've done today. Let's get everyone safe first," Samuel replied, checking Jasper's breathing and condition. "Then we can talk about remembering." The second trip brought back 2 of the Patterson boys, their young arms wrapped tightly around Samuel's waist as Jasper navigated the treacherous crossing. The third brought Mrs. Patterson herself, clutching her youngest child. Each journey became slightly more dangerous as the water continued to rise, but Jasper never faltered, never showed fear or hesitation. By the 5th crossing, word had spread through the north side of town. People gathered along the bank to help dry and warm each rescued person, to offer hot food and blankets. The same community that had scorned Samuel's warnings now organized around his rescue efforts with remarkable efficiency. Jake Morrison met them at the water's edge after the 7th trip. "Pike, you're pushing that donkey pretty hard. How's he holding up?" Samuel patted Jasper's neck, feeling the steady heartbeat beneath wet fur. "He's tired but willing. Donkeys are tough, tougher than people give them credit for. Like their owners," Jake said quietly, the words carrying an acknowledgement that would have been impossible just days before. As afternoon shadows lengthened and the water continued its relentless rise, Samuel prepared for what would need to be the final series of crossings. 7 people remained on the south side, including 3 children who would need to be carried. The ford that had been challenging that morning now approached the limits of safety. Water swirled around Jasper's chest, and debris swept past with increasing frequency. Samuel studied the crossing one more time, knowing that each decision could mean life or death for the people depending on him. 3 more trips, he told Jasper, who stood alert and ready despite hours of dangerous work. 3 more trips, and we get everyone home safe. The 8th crossing nearly ended in disaster. As Samuel guided Jasper back toward the south bank with 2 of the Miller children clinging to his back, a massive log swept downstream and struck the donkey's hindquarters. Only Jasper's incredible strength and Samuel's firm grip kept them all from being carried away by the current. They reached the south bank, shaken but safe, and Samuel dismounted to examine Jasper for injuries. The donkey stood patiently as experienced. Hands checked for cuts or bruises, finding only a few scrapes that wouldn't affect his ability to complete the rescue. 2 more trips, Samuel murmured. But privately, he wondered if the ford would remain passable even that long. The water had risen another 6 inches since their first crossing, and debris now swept past with increasing frequency and violence. Robert Miller approached with his remaining child and his wife, both pale with cold and fear. "Samuel, maybe we should wait. Try again tomorrow when the water might be lower." "There might not be a tomorrow," Samuel replied, studying the angry water. "This ford is our only chance. Once it's gone, anyone left on this side will have to wait for a rescue that might never come." He was preparing for the 9th crossing when old Mrs. Crawford's voice cut through the noise of rushing water. "Wait!" she called from her position on the north bank. "Samuel, before you risk any more lives, there's something you need to know. Something about your father." Samuel paused, one hand on Jasper's bridle. "Ma'am, Jacob Pike saved my husband's life 23 years ago during the Willow Creek flood." "But that's not the whole story." Mrs. Crawford's voice carried clearly across the water. "Your father had maps, hand-drawn maps of every trail, every game path, every hidden route through these mountains. Maps his father made, and his father Before him, the crowd on both sides of the ford fell silent, sensing that something important was being revealed. "What kind of maps?" Sheriff Garrett called out. "The kind that show secret ways through the high country," Mrs. Crawford continued. "Trails that don't appear on any official survey because the Pike family kept them private. Jacob used those trails to guide people to safety during the Willow Creek disaster, but he never told anyone how he knew the routes." Samuel felt something, a cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the river water soaking his boots. "Mrs. Crawford, how do you know about my father's maps?" "Because he showed them to my husband before they attempted the rescue. Henry was one of the men who volunteered to help guide survivors to high ground." Her voice carried the weight of long-kept secrets. "Your father made him swear never to reveal the existence of those trails, never to tell anyone how the Pike family had mapped every deer path and hidden canyon in 100 square miles. The implications hit Samuel like a physical blow. If his father had possessed such detailed knowledge of the high country, and if those maps still existed— "Samuel," called Robert Miller from behind him, "do you still have your father's belongings?" "Some of them," Samuel replied slowly, his mind racing. "In the cabin, books, papers, tools, including maps?" Mayor Whitman asked, his voice tight with sudden understanding. Samuel's memory flashed to the oilcloth bundle he'd seen countless times in his father's desk, but never examined closely. Jacob Pike had been a private man, and after his death, Samuel had sealed away his papers without detailed study. The grief, too fresh to bear such intimate reminders. "There might be," he admitted, "but even if there are, they won't help us now. Those trails would take days to navigate, and we need to get these people to safety in hours." "Not necessarily," Sheriff Garrett called out. "Samuel, think about it. If your family has been mapping these mountains for generations, there might be emergency routes that you don't even know exist, shortcuts that could save lives if the water keeps rising." The weight of possibility and responsibility settled on Samuel's shoulders like a lead blanket. Every minute spent in discussion was a minute closer to losing the ford entirely. "But if the maps revealed alternatives, Mrs. Crawford," he called across the water, "did my father ever mention a route that bypassed the main valley entirely? Something that could get a large group to safety even if all the lower trails were flooded?" The elderly woman was quiet for a long moment, her weathered face thoughtful. "He spoke once of a high path, something he called the shepherd's route. Said it was treacherous but reliable, that it could carry a man clear to the territorial road without descending below the floodline." Samuel's breath caught. The territorial road ran along the eastern ridge, connecting Cedar Bend to the outside world through a series of switchbacks that climbed above any conceivable flood level. "If a direct route existed, how long would it take to reach your cabin and check?" Jake Morrison called out. Samuel calculated quickly. 20 minutes each way if I push Jasper hard, but I can't leave people stranded while I go looking for maps. That might not exist. "You can't save us all if this crossing becomes impossible either," Robert Miller said grimly. "Samuel, if those maps show a way to get everyone out of the valley safely, including the people trapped in the high country, isn't that worth the risk?" The decision tore at Samuel's conscience. Every instinct told him to complete the rescue at hand, rather than chase possibilities. But the ford was deteriorating rapidly, and even if he managed to bring everyone across, they would still be trapped in a valley that might flood completely. Jasper seemed to sense his master's turmoil. The donkey turned his head and looked directly at Samuel, dark eyes reflecting an intelligence that sometimes seemed almost human. In that gaze, Samuel saw patience and trust, absolute faith that whatever decision was made would be the right one. 10 minutes, Samuel announced. "I'll check the maps and be back in 10 minutes. If they show what Mrs. Crawford thinks they might, we'll have options. If not, we finish the crossing as planned." He mounted Jasper and pushed the tired donkey into a controlled gallop back toward his cabin. The ride that usually took 30 minutes at a careful pace compressed into a breathless 10-minute race against time and rising water. At the cabin, Samuel burst through the door and went straight to his father's desk. The oilcloth bundle waited, exactly where he remembered it, wrapped with careful precision and sealed against moisture. His hands shook slightly as he unwrapped the contents. Maps, dozens of them, drawn in his father's careful hand on paper that had been treated to resist. Water and decay. Some showed familiar territory from conventional perspectives, but others revealed the mountains as no official survey had ever captured them. A three-dimensional maze of hidden canyons, forgotten passes, and secret ways known only to the Pike and family. And there, marked with red ink and labelled Shepherd's Route Emergency Only, was exactly what Mrs. Crawford had described. A trail that began just 2 miles upstream from the ford climbed steadily through a series of natural terraces and emerged directly onto the territorial road. The map included notations about water sources, dangerous crossings, and camping spots that suggested generations of careful exploration. But the most important notation was written in his father's stern hand across the top of the map, passable for sure-footed mounts only. Horses will panic, suitable for donkeys, mules, experienced mountain ponies. Allow 4 hours for groups with children. 4 hours. Samuel studied the route with growing excitement. 4 hours to safety for everyone in the valley if they were willing to trust their lives to trails that appeared on no official map and to the sure feet of animals bred for mountain work. He rewrapped the maps in fresh oilcloth and secured them in his saddlebags. Outside, Jasper stood ready despite his exhaustion, sensing that this ride would determine everything that followed. The return trip to the ford revealed that his 10-minute absence had cost them precious time. The crossing was now barely passable, with water swirling dangerously close to Jasper's chest. But more importantly, the people on both sides of the river were looking at him with expressions of desperate hope. "Well," Sheriff Garrett called out as soon as Samuel came within earshot. Samuel held up the oilcloth bundle, his voice carrying clearly over the rushing water. "The Shepherd's Route exists. It can get us all to safety, but we'll need to trust in trails our family has kept secret for 3 generations. And you think your donkey can guide us through mountain paths that would challenge experienced climbers?" Dr. Henley asked skeptically. Samuel looked down at Jasper, who stood alert and ready despite hours of dangerous work. "I think my donkey and I are about to prove that some forms of transportation were chosen for wisdom rather than appearance." The moment of truth had arrived. Cedar Bend would either trust the knowledge that 3 generations of pikemen had accumulated through careful observation and hard-earned experience, or they would remain trapped in a valley that might soon become a lake. The decision crystallized when another wall of water, smaller than the first but still devastating, came thundering down the creek bed. Samuel saw it coming first, a brown surge carrying the remains of what had once been a barn somewhere upstream. The wooden structure tumbled end over end like a child's toy, smashing against rocks and trees with sounds that echoed off the valley. "Walls, everyone back from the water!" Samuel shouted, his voice cutting through the general noise of panic and confusion. The people on both sides of the ford scrambled to higher ground just as the surge hit, sending spray 20 feet into the air and completely obliterating what remained of the crossing. Where 10 minutes before there had been a dangerous but passable ford, now only violent rapids remained. The water had risen another 2 feet and showed no signs of stopping. Any hope of completing the individual rescues died with the last safe crossing. "That settles it," Sheriff Garrett announced grimly. "Pike, we're going to need that mountain route of yours. The whole valley's turning into a lake." Samuel studied the maps again, this time with the focused intensity of a man whose decisions would determine whether his neighbors lived or died. The Shepherd's Route demanded careful timing and perfect weather conditions. In rain, with frightened people and potentially panicked animals, it would test every skill his father had taught him. "Everyone listen carefully," Samuel called out, his voice carrying the authority that came from genuine expertise. "We're going to attempt something that's never been tried with this many people. I can guide you to safety, but only if everyone..." Follows instructions exactly. No questions, no debates, no second-guessing. When I say stop, you stop. When I say move, you move immediately. Mayor Whitman stepped forward, his political instincts warring with the reality of their situation. Pike, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but perhaps we should consider other options. Maybe wait for outside rescue. There won't be any outside rescue, Samuel interrupted. The main road into the valley crosses that creek in 4 places. All 4 crossings are either gone or will be soon. We're on our own. Mrs. Crawford nodded from her position, wrapped in blankets. Samuel's right. I remember the Willow Creek flood. It was 3 weeks before help could reach the survivors, and by then most of them were already dead from exposure. The weight of their isolation settled on the crowd like a physical presence. Cedar Bend had always prided itself on self-reliance, but this situation demanded more than frontier toughness. It required trust in knowledge they didn't possess and skills they couldn't understand. What do you need from us? Jake Morrison asked, his earlier arrogance replaced by pragmatic recognition of their circumstances. Samuel spread his father's map on a flat rock, weighing down the corners with stones. The hand-drawn lines and careful notations represented 3 generations of Pike family knowledge, accumulated through decades of careful exploration and hard-earned experience. First, we need to get everyone to the south side. The trail begins. Over there, about 2 miles upstream where the valley narrows. He pointed to markings on the map. Second, we can only take what people can carry on their backs. No wagons, no heavy belongings, nothing that will slow us down or cause someone to lose their footing. What about the horses? Tom Bradley asked, gesturing toward the fine thoroughbreds that represented significant investments for their owners. Samuel's answer was delivered with gentle but absolute firmness. Horses panic in narrow places with steep drop-offs. The trail includes several passages where one misstep means a 100-foot fall. Your beautiful animals would bolt at the first dangerous crossing and probably take their riders with them. But surely some of the calmer horses, Dr. Henley began. No. Horses, Samuel repeated. Donkeys and mules only. Animals bred for mountain work, with the sense to test their footing before committing their weight. He looked around the group. I know that's hard to accept, but it's not negotiable. The trail won't accommodate panic or poor judgment. Charlie. Whitman raised his hand tentatively. How many donkeys and mules are available in the valley? Samuel had already calculated this crucial limitation. Jasper and 2 other donkeys at the Peterson place. Old Pete Miller has a mule for his freight runs. The widow Henderson keeps a small Jenny for her garden work. Maybe 7 or 8 animals total that are suitable for mountain travel. The mathematics were sobering. Nearly 40 people would need to reach safety, but only a handful could ride. The majority would have to walk a treacherous mountain trail in conditions that challenged experienced climbers. Samuel, Mrs. Patterson asked quietly, how dangerous is this trail really? He could have lied, could have minimized the risks to prevent panic. But these people deserved honesty as they faced the most important decision of their lives. Dangerous enough that my father marked it emergency only and warned that it was suitable for experienced mountain travelers with proper equipment. Samuel met each person's eyes in turn. We don't have proper equipment, and most of you have never been above the tree line, but staying here means certain death, while the trail at least offers hope. What kind of hope? Robert Miller asked, his wife and children huddled close beside him. Samuel traced the route with his finger, explaining as he would to students learning navigation. 4 hours of steady climbing through terrain that gets more demanding as we go higher, several stream crossings that will be treacherous in current conditions. At least 2 passages where the trail runs along cliff faces with significant exposure. He paused, letting the reality settle before continuing. But if we make it through, we emerge directly onto the territorial road, completely above the flood and zone. From there, it's a day's walk to the nearest town and real help. The silence that followed was broken by the sound of more debris crashing past in the swollen creek. Everyone could see that the water was still rising, still carrying away pieces of the world they had known. Sheriff Garrett spoke first. "I'm willing to try it. Staying here is suicide, and I've seen what Samuel can do when lives are at stake. I'll go where Samuel leads," Mrs. Crawford added firmly. "That man saved my life today, and his father saved my husband's life 23 years ago. The Pike family knows these mountains." One by one, the others agreed, some reluctantly, some with obvious fear, but all recognizing that their situation offered no comfortable alternatives. Mayor Whitman was among the last to commit, his political instincts finally overwhelmed by survival necessities. "Very well," Whitman said heavily. "But I want it understood that you're assuming enormous responsibility, Pike. If people die following your guidance, people will die if they don't follow it," Samuel replied calmly. "The question is whether you trust 40 years of Pike family knowledge or prefer to take your chances with rising water." The organization of the evacuation revealed both the best and worst of human nature under pressure. Some people immediately began helping others prepare, sharing supplies and offering encouragement. Others focused on their own concerns, complaining about abandoned possessions or questioning every decision. Samuel found himself managing not just the logistics of the journey, but the psychology of a community in crisis. People who had mocked him days before now hung on his every word, while others resented having to depend on someone they considered beneath their social status. "Listen to me," he announced as the group prepared to move upstream. "Before we start this journey, everyone needs to understand something. On that trail, there are no rich people or poor people, no important families or outcasts. There are only people who follow instructions and stay alive, and people who don't." He gestured toward Jasper, who stood patiently loaded with emergency supplies and ready to lead them into the mountains. "That donkey you've all laughed at is going to guide us through terrain where one mistake kills everyone behind the person who makes it. Your fine horses, your expensive clothes, your social positions, none of that matters where we're going." The rebuke was gentle, but unmistakable, and Samuel watched as shame and recognition played across familiar faces. These were good people, who had let prejudice cloud their judgment, but crisis had a way of clarifying what truly mattered. "Samuel's right," Jake Morrison said, surprising everyone including himself. "We've been fools to judge a man by his circumstances instead of his character. Today, he's shown us what real worth looks like." The young man's words seemed to release something in the group, a collective acknowledgement of errors made and lessons learned too late. But Samuel had no time for lengthy reconciliations. The light was fading, the weather was worsening, and every minute of delay increased the danger they would all face. "Save the apologies for when we're all safe," he said, checking his equipment. "One final time. Right now, we need to move like our lives depend on it, because they do." As the group began its careful progress upstream toward the hidden trailhead, Samuel took one last look at Cedar Bend. The town that had scorned him now lay partially underwater, its familiar buildings transformed into islands in an ever-widening lake. Whatever happened on the mountain trail ahead, the community they had known was gone forever. But the people could still be saved if courage and mountain wisdom proved stronger than pride and prejudice. The shepherd's route began innocently enough, a deer path winding through scrub oak and pine, barely visible to eyes untrained in reading the mountain's subtle signs. Samuel led the group on foot, with Jasper carrying Mrs. Crawford and the youngest of the Patterson children. The other available donkeys and mules bore additional elderly and injured passengers, while the majority of the group followed on foot. "Stay. Single file," Samuel called back to the line of people stretching behind him. "Step exactly where the person in front of you steps. Don't take shortcuts or try to find easier routes. The path may look simple now, but it gets much more demanding." The first hour passed without serious incident. The trail climbed gradually through familiar forest, and several people commented that the journey didn't seem as treacherous as Samuel had warned. He recognized the dangerous optimism and knew it would be tested soon enough. "How much farther to the difficult sections?" Sheriff Garrett asked, walking directly behind Samuel as the informal second-in-command of their desperate convoy. Samuel consulted his father's map, comparing the hand-drawn landmarks to the terrain around them. "We're about to reach what Pa called the first gate. It's where the trail crosses Widow Creek on a natural stone bridge. The crossing itself isn't dangerous in dry weather, but with all this rain," as if summoned by his words, the sound of rushing water grew audible ahead. The group emerged from the trees to find Widow Creek transformed from a seasonal trickle into a torrential cascade. The natural stone bridge that Jacob Pike had marked on his map was now a slippery arch over water that roared with deadly force. "Dear God," whispered Dr. Henley, staring at the crossing that would be required. "That's not a bridge, it's a death trap." The stone formation was perhaps 30 feet long and barely 4 feet wide at its narrowest point. Water from the swollen creek sprayed up through gaps in the rock, making the surface treacherous with moisture and moss. Below, the creek had carved a gorge at least 50 feet deep, with jagged rocks waiting to claim anyone who slipped. Samuel studied the crossing with the methodical care his father had taught him. Every step would need to be planned, every handhold identified in advance. One person panicking or losing their footing could doom the entire group. "I'll go first with Jasper," he announced. "If we can make it across safely, we'll set up a rope line to help the rest of you." "And if you can't make it?" Mayor Whitman asked, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. Samuel didn't answer directly. Instead, he approached Jasper and spoke quietly to the donkey, running experienced hands over the animal's legs and hooves. The donkey's response was typically calm, ears forward, breathing steady, ready to trust his human partner's judgment completely. "Jasper's never failed me yet," Samuel said simply. "Today won't be the first time." The crossing required every skill both man and donkey had developed through years of mountain travel. Samuel led on foot, testing each step before committing. His weight, while Jasper followed with the careful precision that made donkeys invaluable in dangerous terrain. The spray from below made visibility poor and footing treacherous, but they advanced steadily across the natural stone arch. Halfway across, disaster nearly struck. A section of stone, undermined by the constant spray, shifted under Jasper's weight. For a terrifying moment, the donkey's hind legs scrambled for purchase on the slippery surface, while his front hooves fought to maintain balance on the narrow bridge. Samuel reacted instantly, bracing himself against a stable section of stone, and using his body weight to help steady Jasper's balance. The donkey's mountain-bred instincts took over. Instead of panicking like a horse would have, he stood perfectly still until his footing stabilized, then carefully repositioned himself on more solid ground. "Easy, boy," Samuel murmured, his heart pounding but his voice steady. Just like crossing the creek behind the cabin, one step at a time. They completed the crossing to find secure footing on the far side, where Samuel immediately began setting up the rope system that would help the others follow. The people waiting on the opposite side had watched the near disaster with growing horror, but they had also seen something else: absolute trust between man and animal, and skills that no amount of money could purchase. "Mrs. Crawford goes next," Samuel called across the gorge. "She's lightest and has the most experience trusting other people's judgment." The elderly woman made the crossing with remarkable composure, her arthritic hands gripping the rope, while Samuel guided her steps from his position on the far side. One by one, the others followed, some with confidence, others paralyzed by fear but driven forward by necessity. Jake Morrison surprised everyone by volunteering to help from the starting side, steadying each person before they began the terrifying crossing. The young man who had once mocked Samuel's humble circumstances now risked his own life to help others reach safety. The children required special handling, carried one at a time by adults who understood that a moment's carelessness would mean watching a young life disappear into the gorge below. Each successful crossing brought cheers from both sides, but Samuel allowed no celebration until the last person stood safely on the far side of Widow Creek. "That was the easy part," he announced once everyone had gathered. "The real test starts now." The Devil's Ledge appeared through the mist like something from a nightmare. The trail, which had been steadily narrowing for the past hour, now reduced to a shelf of rock barely 3 feet wide. To their right, the mountain wall rose vertically into the grey sky. To their left, empty space yawned for 200 feet before ending in a jumble of boulders that would crush any human body to powder. Samuel stood at the edge of this passage, studying his father's map one final time. Jacob Pike had marked this section with multiple warnings. Extreme danger, no room for error, send riders across one at a time, steady nerves essential. "How long is this section?" Sheriff Garrett asked, his weathered face pale as he contemplated the exposed traverse ahead. 300 yards, Samuel replied, folding the map carefully. "Maybe 400. The trail widens again once we reach the far side, and from there it's a gradual descent to the territorial road." The group had bunched together at the ledge's beginning, and Samuel could feel fear spreading like a contagion. Several people were openly weeping, others stood frozen, unable to force themselves onto the narrow path. The children clung to their parents with the desperate grip of those who sensed mortal danger without fully understanding it. "I can't do this," Mrs. Patterson whispered, her face ashen. "I can't walk out there with my children. What if they slip? What if I slip? Then we all die here," Samuel said gently but firmly, "because this is the only way to safety. There's no going back. The water's risen too high behind us." He was right. During their climb, the flood had continued its relentless advance. The valley they had left was now completely underwater, and even their current elevation might not remain safe if the rain continued. Samuel mounted Jasper and guided the donkey to the beginning of the ledge. "I'm going across first to check the condition of the trail. Then I'll come back for Mrs. Crawford and the first group." "Samuel," Mayor Whitman called out, his voice cracking with strain, "if something happens to you out there, we're all dead." "Are you sure about this?" For the first time since the rescue began, Samuel smiled, an expression that held both confidence and the weight of absolute responsibility. "Mr. Mayor, a week ago you wouldn't trust me to predict the weather. Now you're trusting me with your life and the lives of everyone you care about. That's quite a change." Whitman's face flushed, but he nodded slowly. "I was wrong about you, Pike. We all were, desperately, shamefully wrong." "Save the apologies for solid ground," Samuel replied. "Right now, watch how Jasper handles this crossing. He's going to teach you something about courage." The donkey stepped onto the ledge with calm determination, where a horse would have shied from the exposed drop-off. Jasper moved forward steadily, his sure hooves finding secure placement on the wet rock. Samuel sat perfectly balanced in the saddle, his body moving with the donkey's rhythm, both of them demonstrating the partnership that came from years of shared danger. Halfway across, a section of the outer edge crumbled away, sending rocks tumbling into the abyss below. The sound echoed off the mountain walls like thunder, and several people on the safe side screamed in terror. But Jasper paused, tested the remaining rock with one careful hoof, then adjusted his path to avoid the weakened area. The watchers held their breath as donkey and rider navigated around the fresh hazard with the precision of dancers performing at the edge of death. They reached the far side to thunderous cheers from the group still waiting to cross. Samuel dismounted and immediately began setting up anchors for the rope system that would help the others traverse the deadly passage. The crossing took 2 hours. Each person who made the journey did so with the knowledge that their life depended entirely on Samuel's guidance and Jasper's steady presence. The donkey made multiple trips, carrying children and elderly passengers, never once showing fear or hesitation despite the mortal danger. Jake Morrison crossed on foot, his hands gripping the safety rope so tightly his knuckles went white. When he reached the far side, He collapsed to his knees, overwhelmed by the realization of how close death had been. "I'm sorry," he sobbed as Samuel helped him to his feet. "God forgive me. I'm so sorry for the way we treated you. You could have left us all to die, and no one would have blamed you." "That's not who I am," Samuel replied simply, "and it's not who my father raised me to be." But it was Mrs. Patterson's transformation that captured the moment most clearly. As she stepped onto solid ground with her children safe beside her, she turned to face the group, gathering on the secure ledge. "Look at us," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. "Look what it took to teach us the difference between what we have and who we are. Samuel Pike owns nothing but a donkey and his father's wisdom, but he's the richest man among us, rich in courage, rich in knowledge, rich in the kind of character that risks everything to save others." One by one, the others made their confessions as they completed the crossing. Dr. Henley admitted that education meant nothing without wisdom. Charlie Whitman acknowledged that breeding and money were poor measures of a man's worth. Even Banker Morrison, his expensive clothes torn and muddy, thanked Samuel with tears streaming down his face. The final crossing brought Mayor Whitman himself, who had insisted on being the last to leave the starting point. As he stepped onto solid ground, the big man removed his hat and stood before Samuel with a humility that would have been unimaginable a week earlier. "Samuel Pike," he said formally, his voice carrying the weight of absolute sincerity. "On behalf of everyone here, I apologize for the prejudice and mockery you've endured. You are a better man than any of us." Samuel looked around at the faces surrounding him, people who had scorned his circumstances but now understood his worth. In that moment of recognition, 43 lives had been saved, and something equally precious had been restored, a community's understanding of what truly mattered. "The debt is paid by your safe arrival," Samuel said quietly. "That's all the payment I ever wanted." 6 months later, Samuel Pike rode Jasper down the main street of New Cedar Bend, built on higher ground 3 miles from where the original town had stood. The morning sun caught the fresh-cut lumber of new buildings and the gleaming bronze plaque mounted on a granite boulder in the center of the town square. The memorial bore simple words, "In gratitude to Samuel Pike and Jasper, whose courage and wisdom saved 43 lives during the Great Flood. True worth is measured not in possessions, but in character." Samuel paused to read the inscription, as he did most mornings, still somewhat amazed by the transformation it represented. The plaque had been Mayor Whitman's idea, but the entire community had contributed to its creation and placement. More importantly, they had contributed to the changes in heart and attitude that made such recognition possible. "Morning, Samuel," called Mrs. Henderson from the porch of her new boarding house. "Coffee's fresh if you have time to stop." "Much obliged, Mrs. Henderson, but I promised Mrs. Crawford I'd check on her garden today. Rain last night might have done some damage to those tomato plants." The elderly woman waved from her chair on the porch of the small house the community had built for her, a comfortable place with a view of the mountains where she could sit and remember the day she'd trusted her life to a man most folks had considered worthless. At 73, Mrs. Crawford had become something of a local philosopher, frequently reminding younger residents about the lessons learned during their mountain crossing. "Character reveals itself in crisis," she would say, "and crisis reveals character." Samuel guided Jasper through the busy streets, noting the changes that continued to shape their community. Jake Morrison now ran the general store with a fairness and humility that would have surprised his younger self. Charlie Whitman had become the town's deputy sheriff, having discovered that public service was more satisfying than public prominence. Dr. Henley had established a small school where he taught not just reading and arithmetic, but lessons about judging people by their actions rather than their circumstances. His star pupil was young Billy Patterson, who had announced his intention to learn everything possible about mountain navigation and weather prediction. But perhaps the most significant Change was in Mayor Whitman himself. The big man had lost considerable weight during the months of reconstruction, his physical diminishment accompanied by a growth in wisdom and genuine leadership. He governed now through earned respect rather than inherited authority. "Samuel!" the mayor called out as he emerged from the new town hall. "Perfect timing. I wanted to discuss the position we talked about." Samuel dismounted and walked with Whitman to the shade of a large cottonwood that had survived the flood. The tree had become an unofficial gathering place where important community decisions were discussed. "Theodore, I appreciate the offer. But I've told you before, I'm not suited for public office." "Town marshal isn't about politics," Whitman insisted. "It's about knowledge, judgment, and the ability to keep people safe. You've demonstrated all three beyond any question." The offer had been made repeatedly over the past months, along with others that would have elevated Samuel's status and improved his financial circumstances. Each had been politely declined, though not without careful consideration. "I do what I do because it's right, not because someone pays me for it," Samuel explained patiently. "Start paying me for helping people, and it changes the nature of the help." Whitman nodded, though his expression showed he still didn't fully understand Samuel's reasoning. The former banker in him struggled with the concept of valuable services provided without direct compensation. "At least consider the house," Whitman said. "The community wants to build you a proper place in town, something fitting for a man who's done what you've done." Samuel looked back toward the mountains where his small cabin sat on its rise overlooking the valley. The structure was simple but sound, positioned exactly where his father had taught him to build, high enough to stay safe, close enough to help when needed. "My cabin suits me fine, Theodore. It's got everything I need and sits exactly where I can do the most good." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sarah Peterson and her children, now frequent visitors to the town square. Billy Peterson had grown several inches since the flood and carried himself with the quiet confidence that came from surviving real danger. "Mr. Pike," Billy said formally, "Ma sent me to ask if you'd teach me about reading weather signs. She says it's important knowledge that shouldn't be lost." Samuel smiled, recognizing in the boy the same curiosity about the natural world that his own father had encouraged decades earlier. "I'd be honored, Billy. Come by the cabin this weekend, and we'll start with the basics." As the day progressed, Samuel made his usual rounds through the community, checking on elderly residents, helping with construction projects that required experienced judgment, sharing knowledge about everything from irrigation to animal husbandry. Each interaction was marked by a respect that had been earned through demonstration, rather than demanded through privilege. At Mrs. Crawford's house, he found the elderly woman tending her garden with the careful attention of someone who had learned not to take growing things for granted. "Samuel," she said, looking up from her tomato plants, "I've been thinking about something. About the day we crossed the mountains and what it taught us." "What's that, Mom?" "We spent so much time laughing at you for riding a donkey instead of a horse, but when the crisis came, your donkey was the only animal in the valley brave enough and smart enough to save us." She paused, studying his weathered face. "I wonder how many other things we've been judging by the wrong standards." Samuel considered her words while examining the garden's condition. The tomato plants had indeed suffered from the previous night's storm, but the damage was manageable. A few broken branches and some scattered fruit that could be salvaged with proper care. "I reckon," he said slowly, "that most things worth having don't look like much from the outside. Good soil doesn't shine like gold, strong timber doesn't gleam like polished brass, and the most reliable friends are often the ones who don't make the biggest impression at first meeting." Mrs. Crawford nodded approvingly. "Your father would be proud of the man you've become, Samuel, and proud of the community you helped create." As evening approached and Samuel prepared to return to his cabin, he found himself reflecting on the strange turns life could take. 6 months ago, he had been the object of mockery and dismissal. Today, he was the most respected man in the territory, sought out for advice on everything from building placement to marriage disputes. Yet, in the most important ways, nothing had changed. He still rose each morning to care for Jasper, still read his father's Bible by lamplight, still lived simply, and helped his neighbors without expectation of reward. The respect felt good, but it wasn't why he did what he did. The ride home took him past the flooded valley where old Cedar Bend lay beneath 20 feet of water. Sometimes, on clear days, you could still see the outline of foundations and the tops of the tallest trees. It served as a permanent reminder of nature's power and the importance of listening to warnings that came from experience rather than pride. Jasper climbed the familiar trail toward their cabin with the steady gait that had carried them both through so many challenges. The donkey was older now, a few grey hairs showing around his muzzle, but his step remained sure and his spirit undiminished. At the cabin, Samuel unsaddled his faithful companion and gave him the careful grooming that ended each day. As he worked, he spoke quietly to the animal who had been his partner through everything. Not bad for an old donkey and a poor cowboy, eh, boy? Turns out folks can learn, given the right circumstances. Jasper's response was a gentle nuzzling that conveyed affection, trust, and the contentment that came from a life well lived in service to others. As darkness settled over the valley and Samuel sat on his porch reading by lamplight, he could see the lights of New Cedar Bend twinkling in the distance, a community rebuilt not just with new lumber and fresh paint, but with renewed understanding of what truly mattered in life. Sometimes the greatest victories were won not through conquest, but through the patient demonstration of character. Sometimes the poorest man in town turned out to be the richest in everything that counted.